We've talked about people, process, and systems. We've talked about alignment and sustainability. We've talked about Southwest Airlines. So Southwest Airlines, we can illuminate their capabilities. We can talk about how they're generated. We can illustrate how they are aligned and how they're sustainable. But usually when I talk about Southwest in class, I often have a student who will raise, I think, the obvious question. That's fine and great for Southwest, but how do I, maybe managing another firm or as an entrepreneur, build those capabilities? How do I get those capabilities over time? Well, there's two basic alternatives that you have. First, you could acquire those capabilities from others. There are clearly markets for resources of various types. Labor markets, markets for talent, technology markets, patent markets there, where you can go out and acquire those assets that you need to build the capabilities that you need. Mergers and acquisitions as a way to build capabilities. When you think about something like culture, once again, there is no market for culture. However, there are markets for firms, and one could imagine going out and buying a firm to try to get a piece of that culture, that special sauce that they have that's otherwise very, very hard to observe and articulate. Now, of course, there's some pitfalls to this strategy. One could imagine what would happen to Southwest Airlines if acquired by a Delta or an American Airlines or United Airlines. Would they be able to maintain that distinct culture that they have in place, or would those other entities basically destroy the value that was inherent in that firm in the first place? There are other strategies as well, various forms of alliances, associations. Corporate venture capital is when established companies take equity stakes in small entrepreneurial ventures. They often do this as a way to acquire various resources and capabilities from those ventures, basic forms of know-how and the like. There are some limitations to this approach, though. Our same fundamental principle applies here as it does as we've talked about it in the past. If there is a competitive factor market, it's going to be very difficult to acquire capabilities in a way that will create value for you. Basically, when we think about factor markets, the markets for these things that we buy, there needs to be some imperfection. Otherwise, we'll end up bidding up the price of these assets so high that the value they create for us is not going to be sufficient to cover the cost of acquisition. Think about the labor market once again for professional athletes. A few years back in the National Basketball Association, LeBron James became a free agent. Many teams were bidding for his services. Arguably, if it was a true, perfectly competitive market, then the price paid by the team that ultimately won, the Miami Heat, could be so high that the value he creates for the franchise might be less than the money they ended up having to pay for him. So how do we get out of this? Well, there's two things to consider here. You need either superior information about the value of an asset or pre-existing complementary capabilities that make the asset more valuable to you than to others. People might have read Michael Lewis's book Moneyball or seen the recent movie version of it starring Brad Pitt. In Moneyball, we are told the story of the Oakland A's, a team that was a small market team with limited assets. They yet were able to compete with the other players, other teams within the league by leveraging superior know-how. They went out there and they leveraged information, they leveraged mathematical analysis in their case, to be able to identify underpriced assets in the market and acquire them for less than their full value for what they would contribute to the team. So let me try to illustrate this here on a little graph. Imagine we have two firms here, a leader and a laggard. There's some performance attribute, perhaps it's quality, perhaps it's environmental performance, and there's some value that is created from that performance level. An information story would be the following: that everyone faces the same distribution and that the leader has simply discovered that having performance a little further out there will lead to greater value than our laggard had. This would be, again, one firm recognizing that the value of some, let's say, professional athlete is more than others are valuing them, and so they can get them on the cheap. That can create value. The complementarity story is a little more complicated. What we see here are two different distributions representing two different firms. It may very well be that for one firm, the laggard position is the best they can do versus another firm where the leader position is the best they can do. Thinking about a market for talent once again, it may very well be that LeBron James created more value for the Miami Heat than he would have for other competing teams. Maybe it was the mix of other players in hand at Miami increased his value more than in other locations. So as a result, Miami was willing to pay more for his services, but they didn't have to pay his full value to them. They just had to pay more than the next closest team's valuation of him, creating a margin there where they can still benefit from that asset. So you can acquire them externally. The other alternative to build capabilities is to develop them internally over time. Now, there's a number of ways that firms do this. We hear firms talking about this all the time. New product development, internal R&D, knowledge management, training, leadership are all about how do we build capabilities within our own organization. I would argue, though, even in that situation, you still must have either superior information, pre-existing complementary capabilities, or, I haven't mentioned yet, just simply luck, that you luck into one of these resources. Well, why is that? Well, if everyone can recognize that this is the best way to move forward, and everyone can execute on that at the same level, we're still in the same problem that everyone will end up having the same capability, will not satisfy our conditions for a superior competitive advantage. Imagine back a few years ago where the emergent market for tablet computers was coming down the pipeline. What if everybody could recognize that this was the next new thing, a very attractive market opportunity, and everybody could have executed on it at the same exact level? Well, then it would be very hard for anyone to get a competitive advantage in that segment. So for someone like Apple to take the lead, they either had to have superior know-why, they knew this is where the market's going and others didn't quite see it that way, or they had to have superior know-how. They had to know this is what we need to do and we can execute on this better and faster than others. Know-why and know-how. Or, once again, it could have just simply been they were lucky, and they've been lucky a number of times in the last few years. So let me end with some summary lessons here. First off, capability analysis helps us identify a firm's value-creating activities. Going back to our first day in this notion of a SWOT analysis, this is in essence the strengths and weaknesses part of a SWOT analysis. Capabilities ultimately arise through the interaction of these people, processes, and systems. We need to think about what are the underlying resources and factors that contribute to the capabilities that we may observe. To the extent that capabilities can provide sustainable competitive advantage, they must be well aligned, both internally and externally, durable, and hard to imitate. Critical questions to ask of any firm that you're analyzing as a strategic analyst about whether or not they have a sustainable competitive advantage. And then finally, the creation question. Superior capabilities are either acquired or built, but they require either superior know-why or know-how or luck once again to be able to get those assets in a way less expensive than the value that they create. Thank you very much, and that is the end of today's session.